Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on Gaza, the numbers and the sources. Last month, the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University published a groundbreaking report entitled Debunking the Genocide Allegations, a re-examination of the Israel-Hamas war from October 7, 2023 to June 1st, 2025. This new study was conducted by a team of multidisciplinary researchers, and it systematically dismantles the most serious false charges levelled at the Jewish state, detailing, amongst others, that accusations that Israel committed crimes against humanity, planned starvation, indiscriminate bombing, and deliberate massacres are without evidence. Professor Danny Orbach, a military historian from the Hebrew University, led the team, including expert quantitative researchers and public international law specialist Jonathan Braverman, to conduct a rigorous factual analysis of the methodologies and evidence behind the allegations, highlighting false data and erroneous information upon which the UN and other aid agencies have based their claims. Now, this is critical, as any proper application of the law first depends upon there being an accurate determination of the facts. Joining me to discuss the numbers and the sources, I'm delighted to introduce Advocate Jonathan Braverman. Jonathan holds degrees in law and business from Reichman University in Herzliya and has practiced as a lawyer specialising in administrative and international law. He moved to the high-tech sector, joining a cybersecurity company and then AI businesses, and is now Chief Operating Officer at a cybersecurity firm specialising in access controls for large language models. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us and for your work alongside Professor Orbach, Dr. Jonathan Boxman and Dr. Yael Henkin on this detailed report. I'll invite the audience to put their questions into the Q&A facility for our discussion to follow, but may I first invite you to give an overview of the report and to address how it deals with the main allegations against Israel that have been raised in the framework of international humanitarian law.
Thank you for having me, Natasha. It is a pleasure to be here. In a sense, the report has its genesis in a study which was conducted by a member of the Israeli academia who made a post stating that after October 7, he felt a need to document in real time the things that Israel is going to do. And when we saw this as the team members, we were stunned because it wasn't even the beginning of the ground incursion. There was still fighting going on inside Israel proper. And already some people were trying to pin the blame on Israel for a response that hasn't even happened yet. And when we started seeing the kind of information that was being gathered and the kind of allegations that were being made against Israel, we pretty much, all of us in our own fields, saw that there was something wrong with this. And it eventually became clear to us fairly quickly that most people were arguing what they thought reality should be instead of what reality actually is. And the problem with that is that the imagery that was coming out of Gaza is conducive to a narrative, which is not necessarily the kind of narrative that fits the facts. I remind the audience that in the beginning of the conflict, the Gaza Health Ministry published immediate warnings that 500 people were killed in the Al-Ahli hospital strike, and that there were mass atrocities being committed by the Israeli forces before we've even started doing anything. Now, the Al-Ahli incident turned out to be a Palestinian rocket. But the people that were dead and the people that died were counted as casualties of the conflict, which are attributed to Israel. And what we set out to do in the report is to answer the question, based on the information that we have, based on the information that is available to everybody online, what is true and what isn't. So what we did is we started to take a look at the allegations and systematically broke them down. We started asking ourselves, is Israel conducting a policy of starvation? Well, what does starvation mean? When we get to what the starvation means, Then we start checking against the benchmarks. Is Israel leading a policy which leads to that benchmark? Is Israel actively pursuing the use of starvation as a method of warfare? Is Israel conducting aerial bombardment campaigns which are indiscriminate by their very nature and by their intent, with the intent of maximizing the number of civilian casualties? Is Israel doing something which is out of line or different from what any modern Western military would do? And our answer, unsurprisingly to this audience, but surprisingly to the people making the allegations, is that Israel did nothing. Not in the sense that Israel is perfect in its conduct of hostilities. The report actually outlines several cases which we found that are, at least to my knowledge, concerning and should be investigated. I'm not making any kind of determination as to the facts of those cases. We're just saying that based on the information available, the authorities should conduct an investigation and handle the case properly. But the allegations for mass starvation, the allegations for genocide, the allegations for indiscriminate bombing, they're baseless. Now, a lot of the report is based on statistical analysis, which goes to the question of how much food is required to maintain the population of Gaza. And the reason why that question comes out as an important question is because that's the key point in proving if starvation happened. Now, we need to get into a bit of the context of the conflict, which is something that most of the reports don't do. Warfare is a very ugly business. Even in the best of times, even when it's conducted in accordance to the principles of international humanitarian law, war is humanity at its worst. And there's no painting war in heroic colors or in pretty colors. People are going to get hurt, which in regular circumstances should not be. People are going to undergo dramatic changes in the way they live, and they are going to be displaced. They are going to be forced out of their homes. They are going to be moving into tents. Their diet is going to change significantly. People that are accustomed to a regular diet of fresh produce and meat are suddenly going to find themselves living off of aid rations. And that is a terrible position objectively to be in. But that is a reality of warfare. That is the reality of a situation in any armed conflict. And you can ask anyone who has been a victim of war how they've been affected. I mean, 400,000 Israelis were displaced because of the events of October the 7th and of Hezbollah's attacks in the north of Israel. Those people were left without homes. Those people were also moved from their places. Those people were also forced to go changes to their routine. And what we found is that a lot of the narrative based on Palestinian suffering, which highlights the human tragedy, ignores Hamas and their responsibility for the causing of that suffering. So one of the things that we would like to highlight is there is a significant question of how the aid is getting into Gaza, how it's being distributed, and is it benefiting the people it should benefit. Now, what we saw as part of the allegations that were being made is that there is a set amount of aid trucks that need to be brought in to cover the needs of the civilian population. So we said, all right, that number is set at 500 trucks based on what? Who based it? Who said it? Does it take into account the diversion of aid? Does it take into account the distribution of aid? Does it take into account local sources? And we found it doesn't. We found that there was no actual basis for the mythical 500 truck figure. And Dr. Boxman conducted a fantastic analysis of that. If you'd like to read the report, then you should read that section carefully because it has a lot of math involved, which is terrifying for lawyers. But it's written in a manner which is clear and concise and makes it understandable as to what the difference is between the facts and the narrative. We also took a look at base principles of international humanitarian law, and we applied those principles to the conduct of hostilities. Now, There are four main principles in international humanitarian law, which any army is obligated to follow. Those principles are distinction, which means you need to distinguish between civilian objects and civilian people, and military objectives, be they objects or military personnel, which are Hamas combatants in this case, or members of organized armed groups, or any civilian which is directly taking part in hostilities. The second principle is the principle of proportionality, which is one of the least understood principles in its application because it is a very counterintuitive principle. The principle of proportionality, as applied in most civil, or rather in most human rights settings, is the action proportional to the threat or to the instigating event. In international humanitarian law, the basis for proportionality is the collateral damage expected to be caused from the targeting of a military objective not excessive with regards to the military advantage which is to be gained? Which means if an army determines a non-combatant cutoff value of, let's say, 5 non-combatants for a terrorist of a set rank, that figure is not a quota. You are not expected to strike 5 non-combatants for every sergeant or above that you target on the other side. It means that you estimate the benefit from taking out that military objective is not excessive so long as it's kept beneath the threshold. Which means, unfortunately, that situations which under human rights law would be considered horrible crimes are a reality of warfare. And that brought us to what is the Excel warfare or the spreadsheet warfare analysis, which is the ratio between how many combatants are killed and how many non-combatants are killed. I'll get to that in a second after I finish the other two principles, which are the principle of military necessity. As I mentioned, the target needs to be struck for a military advantage. It has to be a concrete and direct advantage. And the fourth principle is the principle of humanity. If you have an option between causing more damage or less damage, you're obligated to choose the principle of less damage. That does not mean you're obligated to cancel a strike if you are going to be causing incidental damage. You are allowed to conduct that so long as you meet the cutoff value. But if you can choose between conducting a precision strike with munitions available to you and a non-precise strike with munitions that are available to you, you should prefer the munitions which are less likely to cause incidental damage, so long as there are no other concrete considerations that lead you to prefer the non-guided munitions. And that can be a slew of military considerations, like, for example, how many guided munitions you have. If you only have 10, you can definitely choose to keep those. But going back to the Excel warfare aspect of things, one of the allegations which is generally levied against Israel is that the ratio of combatants to non-combatants killed is, I've seen figures which go to 83% of the dead are not combatants, and that the ratios are terrible and horrible. What we did in the report is we went into the reason why the ratio between non-combatants and combatants looks the way it looks. And that has a lot to do with how Hamas conducts its warfare. Hamas is unique in the way it's embedded. And by Hamas, I also mean the other Palestinian organizations, the other organized armed groups, which includes Palestinian Jihad and other lesser known, but no less dangerous organizations. They've not only embedded themselves in the civilian infrastructure in a manner which is indescribable to someone who hasn't been and hasn't seen the way it is, but they have also dug a network of tunnels, which is estimated to be between 400 and 500 kilometers underneath the entire Gaza Strip. Now, the Strip is only 365 square kilometers, which means they have a tunnel network which is larger than the entire London Underground, the entire London Tube network, in an area which is significantly smaller. If you take the entire London metro area, it's 8,000 square kilometers, and they have less tunnels than Gaza has. They have weaponized every single aspect of the Gaza Strip. They've booby-trapped homes, they've booby-trapped schools, they've booby-trapped hospitals, and to the best of our knowledge, they've also done their absolute best to incentivize the population to remain in combat areas so that the IDF's advances are more difficult. So, on the one side, you have an army which is attempting to conduct hostilities in accordance to the principle of distinction and proportionality. And on the other side, you have organizations which are dedicated as a method and tactic of warfare to maximizing their own effectiveness through the active use of civilian cover. If you ignore that and you don't take that into account, then a combat ratio of 4 or 5 non-combatants for every combatant killed is absolutely awful. It sounds terrible and it is objectively terrible. But those ratios don't tell the whole story. And the reason why they don't tell the whole story is because in international humanitarian law, and that's one of the things that we address, what matters is the information you had before you conducted the strike. What matters is that you adhere to the principle of proportionality in each and every strike, that you assess the potential damage from every action before you conduct it. And if you don't take into account the way your enemies are fighting, you don't take into account the deliberate use of human shields, which we fall short of saying in the report, but it is heavily implied to be a Hamas tactic. There's no way to explain the ratios. But even assuming all that, the worst ratio, the 83% figure I mentioned, assumes that only the people that the IDF can publicly name as being combatants are effective combatants. That is a very tall and difficult order to meet because Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his speech to the UN, stated that our estimates are at 1 combatant to less than 2 non-combatants killed. He didn't publish the sources by which he came to that conclusion, but the Prime Minister of Israel made a public remark, which we are going to be taking for its worth. And the reason why we believe the ratio is significantly lower than the ratio argued is because the tunnels that Hamas use are strictly for military purposes. And bodies recovered from tunnels are generally assumed to be combatants. Or there is a disproportionate, and I mean this in the statistical sense, there's a disproportionate number of men between 15 and 45 in the casualty figures which are reported by the Hamas Gaza ministry, which does not conform to the Gaza population pyramid, which means, at least prima facie, that there is some kind of distinction at work, which goes to the profile of the people which are generally most involved. And if there wasn't an application of distinction and there wasn't an application of proportionality, you would expect to see a more similar distribution from the dead and the injured, which, by the way, are not published by the Gaza Health Ministry in the same way that the dead are published in the casualty reports. Another thing that we get into is the comparison to other conflicts. I don't think that the Gaza conflict, even in the higher end, falls into the spectrum of the worst ratio in this century, let alone in history. And we go into deep details as to how that comparison applies, both in previous combat operations with the IDF, for example, the Jenin alleged massacre, which turned out to be a terrible defeat for Hamas in the West Bank, and other comparative operations in the war against terror conducted by other militaries in the world. Now, I'd like to make a closing point before we go into the next step of the discussion. The allegations that were made against Israel started before Israel began its ground assault. There are distinct phases to how the war was conducted. The defensive phase of October 7 until about October 10 or 11 was when the IDF was still trying to get their footing. and still trying to take control back from the areas which were invaded by a division-sized enemy aggressor. There were between 5,000 and 6,000 Palestinians that came into Israel. That is not a small force to deal with. That is not a small military unit. That is a massive problem. And the Israeli ground incursion didn't happen until the end of October 2023, which means that there was a 20-day aerial bombing period in which the vast majority of combat efforts was directed via Air Force and via airstrikes. To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a single case in which uh, genocide allegation has been made on an aerial campaign, if only because aerial campaigns are generally conducted through the use of a rigorous chain of command and chain of target selection. And it is telling that the vast majority of allegations started or have their origin in the 20 days before we actually got into the ground conflict. It is never about the facts. It is about the narrative and what the image portrays. And that is what we tried to do with the report. We said, let's ignore the Israeli narrative. Let's look at the actual numbers that we can prove. And we came up with conclusions that may not necessarily sit well with some people in the Israeli audience, maybe not with some people in the panel, but we report what we see. And if we see there's no war crimes in the sense of starvation, we report that. And if we see that there are cases that need immediate attention, we will definitely report them. And again, integrity in the integrity mandates that we state, we did not agree with the cessation of aid between March and May 2025. And by we, I mean at least me and Professor Orbach. We thought it was a strategic mistake. But a strategic mistake is not a war crime. A strategic mistake is not a crime against humanity. A strategic mistake is a miscalculation by a warring party. There was no intention to commit starvation because the aid was only stopped based on estimates that there was sufficient aid in the Gaza Strip to last for months. And it was done after strategic consideration, which took into account the needs of the population. Not every mistake in the conduct of warfare is a war crime, and not every war crime is a crime against humanity. And it's telling that even the worst detractors of the Israeli side, which is the ICC complaint lodged against Prime Minister Netanyahu and then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, doesn't go as far as alleging genocide, because even they know they can prove that case.
Jonathan, thank you. I apologize for my voice. Been overusing it. That was a really helpful overview, and I encourage everyone, even if they are perhaps intimidated by the report, which I recall is somewhat over 300 pages. There's also a very helpful executive summary. There is a link to the report in the chat. We'll include the executive summary also, which highlights really the key factual information and misinformation which has been circulating across many of these allegations. There are a number of questions that have come through the Q&A facility already, so I'll start with some of those and encourage the audience to continue adding their questions. One came up specifically in relation to your referencing the Al-Ali hospital strike very early, I think it was the 17th of October 2023, which was in fact, as you say, a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short. The questioner asks whether the 500 victims who were listed are whether they are still listed as dead by the Palestinians. Now, I certainly recall many months after that full story had been debunked, they were still included in the overall casualty figures put out by Hamas. I don't know if you're familiar with the current situation, whether that's now been revised.
So one of the things that we discovered with the Gaza Health Ministry, which is effectively controlled by the Hamas government, is that they tend to make grandiose statements and very small retractions and corrections. So what they tend to do is they publish facts or facts, they publish figures, they publish numbers, and then they quietly go back and change the figures and the numbers. Now, one of the reasons we knew the Al-Hali incident was fake from the get-go, regardless of who shot the rocket, is it took Israel 86 days or even more to finalize the count of the people that were missing after October 7th. It is impossible for the Gaza Health Ministry to be able to say we know 500 people have been killed in this strike.
Within minutes.
It is impossible.
Within minutes, yeah.
It is it is a feat of engineering and a marvel of counting and control that if the Palestinians were able to replicate, they would be the chief administrative consultants that every company would like. If you're able to replicate those results reliably, I would pay good money for those services. The fact is, not only were there not 500 people listed, the Al-Hali incident resulted in significantly less casualties than reported, but there's absolutely no way we can know if we can trust the reports. Not because there were no people injured. We can definitely assume that there was some kind of injury there. But the problem with trusting the Gaza Health Ministry figures, and we discussed this in the report in what we call the inversion funnel, is that if you have a single source which is propagated through via multiple outlets, but that single source is flawed, then the propagation of the information is a propagation of an error, which means if the underlying database is corrupted or otherwise incomplete or otherwise inaccurate, which we were able to demonstrate is happening at least with retroactive changes, then the fact they're repeating the figure doesn't mean the figure is true. It happened with the 500 trucks, it happened with the Al Ali hospital, and it happened with multiple casualty corrections. They added people, they removed people. I don't know if the specifics of the Al Ali hospital are still there.
Yeah.
And even if I did, the IDF intelligence corps would be the persons to ask that question.
Just picking up then on the issue of casualty figures, one hears time and time again this argument that Hamas health ministry figures have been proven to be correct in previous conflicts. And I know the report specifically addresses casualty figures from Sukeitan, the 2014 operation. What were your conclusions in comparing the analysis of the current Hamas casualty figures with those in previous conflicts?
The principal argument is that we're not going to know the full figures until well after the conflict is over. And the reason we're not going to be knowing that is, as I mentioned, there's no way you can trust figures that come out that quickly, that accurately, while in active combat. It is simply not something that stands the test of logic. Now, another thing that we need to highlight on that point, there are a lot of people that are likely buried beneath the rubble and the underground infrastructure. We don't know when those people are going to be pulled out. We can assume those people are involved because Hamas has publicly stated that their tunnels are for their use and not for the civilian population use. But given that the Hamas Health Ministry is the only organization on the ground with access to the numbers, we're using them as a reference not because we trust them, but because they are literally the only source of information that we have. But the fact a source of information is unique does not mean it's reliable. It only means that that's your starting point. And through using that as a starting anchor number, you can start trying to compare. So, for example, if the Hamas Health Ministry declares that this person and this person was dead, and you see open source intelligence posts in which this person is being declared a martyr or is being declared as having died in the service of Al-Aqsa, if that person is reported as a civilian in the Gaza Health Ministry death toll, but the PIJ or Hamas are counting them as a militant, then okay, that person is dead, but the categorization is wrong.
On that, and I just wanted to pick up your reference to the Hamas casualty figures being the only source because they're the only ones with access to be counting, these bodies and to be putting out that information. That, of course, also applied in previous conflicts. So when we hear, oh, but the UN accepted Hamas figures previously or they weren't challenged, I mean, we're dealing with a similar situation of this being, unfortunately, in the circumstances, the only source of casualty figures throughout those previous operations. There is a specific question that's been asked about combatants versus non-combatants and how one defines the difference between the two. In the context of international law, perhaps you can give a brief overview of what IHL says. But the questioner also says when the IDF is in fact, in a lot of circumstances, fighting an invisible army, for example, Hamas in civilian clothing, what are the practicalities of seeking to distinguish?
That's one of the key challenges that is faced in the war against terror. And unfortunately, this is not a new challenge. We've been facing the embedded terrorist organization for a significant amount of time. Um, the traditional view and the dichotomy between a combatant and a non-combatant assumed that armies fight armies. They assumed that there is an advancing military organization which is going against a military organization. If you took the Geneva Conventions in 1949, what they were envisioning was the German tank columns advancing against the US or the UK forces in the Western Front. They were not envisioning a peacekeeping operation of UK paratroopers fighting off IEDs activated by terrorists, which is dressed in traditional Muslim female clothing from a hidden sniper position. And that led to unique challenges because the definition of who is a combatant morphed significantly. There is an attempt to deal with that problem through the use of what's called a direct participant in hostilities doctrine. A direct participant in hostilities is a civilian which takes up arms and is involved in the act of combat. Now, the act of combat doesn't mean they're shouldering a rifle and firing at me. They doesn't mean that they are involved only in the direct commission of aggressive actions against the enemy. A person which is gathering information through the use of signal intelligence, a person which is operating a drone to gather visual intelligence on troop positions, a person which is gathering funds to purchase equipment for people which are involved in the commission of combat functions. If you can tie the money directly to the purchasing of weapons, you could make an argument that that person fulfills a combat function in the same way a quartermaster for the military would be fulfilling a combat function. It is incredibly difficult to apply distinction when you don't have information. And that is something which not only Hamas, but the vast majority of terrorist organizations and non-state organizations in the world take advantage of. So if you send out a 15 or 16-year-old to scout IDF positions, but he has no visible weapon on them, but you know that person is going over to scout positions and report back, there is a problem of classification. Do you consider that person to be fulfilling a combat function or not? And that determination is made by the commander in the field based on the intelligence that they have. So if you know that that building houses an entrance to an underground network, and you have direct visual line of sight to that tunnel entrance, and you see somebody coming out of that tunnel entrance, walking towards your position, and then walking back and going into that entrance, it is a reasonable inference that even though that person is unarmed, he could still be fulfilling a combat role. But if you don't have line of sight, the principle of doubt or the principle of uncertainty in IHL forces you to consider that person to be a civilian unless proven otherwise. They have to be non-combatants. And this translates into a position which can be exploited to minimize the number of combatants which are listed in the casualty reports. If you cannot prove that this person belongs organizationally to Hamas, then he needs to be assumed as a civilian. But what if this person was inducted or drafted by Hamas in 2024 when the Hamas Logistics Corps ceased to function? What if this person took up arms to fight the Israelis coming into Rafah in April of 2024, but he has no previous organization or affiliation? That person is a combatant. And a lot of the determination and a lot of the distinction that has to be made is done based on the intelligence you have before you conduct a strike, be it by the forces on the ground or through a planned airstrike, a planned artillery strike, or planned military operations. How you determine that is a question of fact. And the determination of whether an attack is lawful or unlawful depends on whether or not a military commander armed with the same information given to the person that authorized the strike would have concluded that it was a military target and the strike was proportional. You look at the facts that you have before the attack, not based on the results.
I just want to pause for a moment and emphasize that critical part of the equation, which is that the assessment is based on the information that the military commander making the decision has. And so the notion that that can be second guessed or in some sense judged by entities that simply do not possess that information is also one that utterly lacks credibility in my respectful estimation. Perhaps one of the questions leads into that similar topic to you, Jonathan. It asks how you view UN agency distortions, and it gives the example of 14,000 babies will die in 2 days. My recollection is that was Tom Fletcher's prediction, which was, of course, circulated with enormous speed and enthusiasm by the military. What is your view of distortions like that UN agencies included have been endorsing?
So we're just after the Yom Kippur. So if I were to be on the gracious side and I'd like to not assume ill intent, I'd say that he misspoke. And I'd say that a lot of people with good intentions are making assumptions based on false or flawed data. And they are trying to apply math to a conflict which does not behave in accordance to linear mathematics. And that's if I want to be charitable. If I don't want to be charitable and I want to be factual, certain UN agencies have a dependency on local cooperation with the Gaza authorities, and some of them are even crewed by Gazans. So if we would take the UNRWA case, unfortunately, there are documented cases of members of UNRWA taking part in October 7th. There are documented cases of members of UNRWA also having positions in Palestinian terrorist organizations. So it is a complicated matter in the sense that they are our best source, but our best source is not good. And we cannot rely on their estimates blindly. We need to double check, corroborate, and see if we can come to different assessments. And that leads, for example, to the IPC's assessment. The IPC assessment of what constitutes famine, as we discussed before the podcast, means that there needs to be a mortality rate of 2 people per day per 10,000 people for this to be considered an IPC 5 catastrophic famine event. And the IPC has been warning that this is happening and has been warning that this is reality in the ground and that that is an imminent threat. And that would translate to between 40 and 50,000 people dead from starvation for the period. The actual figures are less than 1,000, which are terrible figures and terrible statistics, and nobody should die from hunger and starvation. But that's not a famine. That's not starvation. And what we are seeing is that even the best of intentions fall either to manipulation by the sources which they are relying on, or they're simply following a narrative and not the actual facts. One of the things that we've noticed is that there is significant undercounting of the amount of aid trucks coming into Gaza because the UN does not count the private sector. And what we did is we said, all right, let's ignore the UN for a second and go to other sources. Who else controls information of how much aid is coming in? And that is the army, the COGAT. So we went and asked COGAT, hey, do you guys have a record of how many trucks are coming in? And they said, sure. And we just pulled the records of the incoming amount of trucks. You subtract the number of trucks that the UN is reporting, and you're left with a significant delta. And those trucks are not parked outside Kerem Shalom. Those trucks are circulating, which means the private sector is delivering aid, which means that other bodies are delivering aid, which means that the UN is not the only source. But if you only rely on the UN, you're missing out on a significant amount of aid that's coming in, which is not through the UN.
So the UN, I think, as an average, has provided and distributed about 30% of the aid in Gaza, which means that 70% of the aid won't be included in these figures, which is extraordinary. And as you say, the Israeli army puts out that information on its website. Kogat has a dedicated website to the Iron Swords operation, and that is publicly available information. So just inexcusable that it would not be considered by these reports and these successive sets of analyses that have made these entirely implausible predictions based on only partial information. And if I remember correctly, those were the words used by the Famine Review Committee in reviewing some of these previous IPC reports. Jonathan, I also just wanted to pick up on what you've said about the sources of the information and who these NGOs and so-called human rights organizations are relying upon, because I had quite a bit of engagement with Amnesty International in that I was invited to debate them with representatives both in Copenhagen and in Oslo, specifically about their report alleging genocide. And I took both of those representatives to the methodology section of their report, which neither seemed particularly familiar with, which made it clear that they did not have people on the ground in Gaza. And so they relied on local government authorities for their information, which, of course, you and I, and I'm sure many in the audience will know, is Hamas. And that cycle has become very well established, where these NGOs, humanitarian organizations, will take that Hamas information, or as some may refer to it as propaganda, put it onto their headed paper, and that will then be cycled into, the UN Human Rights Council, the reports of the Commission of Inquiry that we just had one further report from a couple of weeks ago, which concluded starvation on a very similar basis of this sort of false information. Similarly, reports of this nature being picked up by the ICC, by the ICJ, and then in turn being pointed to by human rights organizations saying, see, these authoritative bodies say so. What many questioners have been asking is, how does one break that cycle of disinformation? With the report that you have drafted, with the detail and the factual information that you have put across, what has the reception been, for one? And separately, how does one ensure that that false information that has been so now well established and, if you will, laundered through the process that I've just described, how can that successfully be challenged by the information and the facts that you have put out?
It is a very difficult proposition, which is it's not easy to answer. And the reason it's not easy to answer is because the complicated messaging and truth of a 311-page report cannot be summarized in an 8-second soundbite and cannot be displayed in a TikTok video. We have a significant disadvantage in the fact that we are undoubtedly the stronger party in the conflict. We are undoubtedly the party which is responsible for the most destruction to the counterparty. And we are undoubtedly the party which is considered to be the aggressor, whether that is correct or incorrect, which means we're starting off on the wrong foot. But even given all that, the main problem that we have is that people don't want to believe. They want to believe simple stories with simple narratives. They want to believe simple cases. I see a hungry child. I therefore understand that somebody's making that child hungry. There is a war going on. Therefore, the people waging war are making that child hungry. That is a reasonable inference and narrative. To understand that that child is hungry because the aid that is being provided by the people waging war against the terrorist organization, which is diverting the aid, and therefore it is not reaching the population, is a very difficult claim to make. And even if you were to go to Kerem Shalom or to Zikim or to any of the other checkpoints, and you were visually confirming the amount of aid which is waiting just to be picked up and moved, the visual narrative is significantly more challenging, because what you see is a warehouse and you see an open warehouse, and it is easier to believe that people are withholding the aid from coming in than there are logistical problems in distributing that aid. One of the reasons that we know this is a fact is nobody has ever made a war movie about the logistics. Nobody has ever taken the narrative on the nitty-gritty and the details of how things are supposed to go. If you were to film a quartermaster filling out papers for 2.5 hours, nobody would watch that. That's not a powerful message. But the logistics core, the COGAT, the people driving the trucks, the people that actually make sure the aid gets to where it needs to get, that is a more difficult story to tell, but that is also the reality. Now, I am not going to disagree with the claim that there are some hungry people in Gaza. That is a factual claim. What is not a factual claim is that there is widespread cases of famine, and it is definitely not true that there is starvation. And this goes back into the questions of whether the effects of warfare and how that has a day-to-day impact on the lives of people. If your local supply chain is disrupted and you cannot go to the supermarket, you are going to suffer from significant decrease in the availability that you have to food and to sustenance. That does not mean you're going to be starving. It just means that your diet is going to be significantly restricted. It means that you're going to be limited in your options. It is definitely a human tragedy, but human tragedies do not immediately translate into misdoings by the other side. And it is a very difficult case to make and a difficult case to argue in the same sense that criminal defense lawyers or civil injury lawyers have to argue as defendants that, yes, this is a tragic outcome, but the tragic outcome does not constitute fault for the people I'm representing. You're casting yourself in a position where you want to have sympathy for the other side, you want to feel their pain, and you need somebody to blame because that's how humans are wired to work. And it is a message which goes to logic and not to sentiment, because we cannot convince people on the sentimental level that what we're doing is correct. It is simply counterintuitive to what we're doing, which is why we made the effort of making the logical case to the best of our ability, using all of the information that we have at our disposal to say we agree that this is a tragedy. We agree that this should not happen. And if you give us back our hostages and declare you're surrendering, this war would end yesterday. If you accept the Trump peace plan, there is absolutely no reason for us to continue doing this. The only reason we're there is because you refuse to stop the conflict. We don't want to be there. Nobody wants to be there.
Um, what you have highlighted in terms of, the difficulties of getting the facts and the narrative through is highlighted by a number of the questioners. What one asks, what can be hoped to achieve? What can be hoped to achieve with these presentations of facts when those accusing Israel with the blood libel are immune to facts and were not persuaded by such from the beginning? And there's a reference here to the genocide lie been going for many millennia against the Jewish people. But of course, there's no other option, is there? It is so important. What's the alternative to accept the false narratives and the false information? And I think what your report does, and I appreciate it is dense, but it is necessarily so because it contains the data and the factual circumstances of it. There's no alternative to putting this information out. There is a reference in the report to a matter that I had actually been unaware of and was very instructive in highlighting what you have described as the psychological element here. And it's that this false alarmist narrative, which has become ingrained and is therefore immune to challenge, is specifically immune to challenge because of its humanitarian and emotional impact. And that's why it seems that most people won't be open to understanding the factual circumstances behind it. And the example that's raised is the sanctions that were imposed by America on Iraq in the 1990s, and this prevalent story that it seems is still disseminated in some media sources that the US sanctions regime caused about 500,000 deaths of Iraqi children from malnutrition, something which I understand was even acknowledged by Madeleine Albright, even though it is entirely false. And I believe that there wasn't a single death that was recorded from malnutrition in Iraq amongst children in that period. What does that example tell us about the best way, perhaps, of learning from that experience and of seeking to make sure that the analysis that you and your colleagues have put forward in this report is potentially picked up by media? Because so many of the questioners have asked about how this gets into the mainstream media commentary about the conflict.
So, first of all, it highlights the importance of having military historians in your team. Professor Orbach and Dr. Henkin are knowledgeable in ways which are significantly more noticeable than I am in comparison to other conflicts in history. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes in the sense that we can learn from those cases that regimes which appeal to the humanitarian sentiment of the West generally do so as part of a concerted tactic to get the superior military force to withdraw. And they usually do this because they understand that popular perception is as effective, if not more effective, than certain combat operations. If you only have the hearts and minds at your disposal because you are severely at disadvantage in any other aspect of warfighting, you are going to be arguing that everything the other side does is indiscriminate and that everything the other side does is disproportionate and that they go against the principle of humanity. And the reason they are doing that is because the Western mode of thinking, the Western way of life, is rooted in rule of law mentality, which is why what you're seeing is a lot of those regimes or a lot of those cases moving from calling wars unjust to calling them illegal, moving from calling the conduct of hostilities not something which is unfair or criticizing the actual conduct, but going into legality, going into the technicality. And this goes into what message we can send as defenders of facts. There are three audiences for the report. The first audience and the most narrow audience are the decision makers, the people that are actually expected to read the entire thing and see, wait, these are the facts. So based on this, we can establish a diplomatic assessment of the situation. So if the Foreign Office in the UK would get a copy of this report and say, all right, these guys are making a very good point that it's not a legal violation of law, then we've done our part. So that's the most narrow audience. Another slightly less narrow audience are the professional levels. And the professional levels are the armies, the NGOs, the humanitarian community, the UN bodies, those that are open and receptive to the message in understanding how to apply these lessons to other cases. So one of the things I'd like to highlight is that the vast majority of criticism that's being levied against Israel does not come from military sources. And that's not just because the militaries are apolitical. It's because I am doubtful that you're going to be finding a high-ranking official which is going to be looking at the factual conduct of how the IDF is conducting its operations in Gaza, which is going to be saying, yeah, we would have done things significantly different. I mean, I've seen Andrew Fox's criticism on how we've handled the GHF sites and that he disagrees with some of the tactical implementations of our rules of engagement. And that is a fair argument. That is a fair discussion. But the discussion is on the level of how do you control a crowd of 16,000 or 20,000 people heading to a distribution site. It's not a discussion on whether or not there should be a distribution site.
With Hamas firing on civilians who are going to these distribution sites in
Uh,
unprecedented scenarios.
it is a scene of human tragedy which I would not wish upon my worst enemies. The despair that is concentrated in those areas, it is I think it is the worst consequence of warfare by far because it disproportionately affects civilians and is also unavoidable. The people that go there have to go there because it is the best way to get aid in their area. And I'm fully aware that it is not a pleasant experience, and that is an understatement.
I just want to highlight an important aspect of the context here because in the report you make it very clear that a lot of the allegations have been put forward without the context of the unprecedented urban armed conflict that Israel is engaged in, without even the context of Hamas being
Yes.
a warring party, which is extraordinary. But the whole question of aid and also the evacuation of civilians into zones such as the Al Mawasi humanitarian area is taking place without any discussion of Egypt's border with Gaza, which of course has been resolutely closed to those that cannot pay the extortionate fees that the Egyptian authorities seek to extract from anyone who wishes to cross. And the fact that that is a violation of international law, of Egypt's obligations, including under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it has signed itself up to. The counterfactual, if we consider for a moment, of how easy it would be to provide those civilians with unlimited humanitarian assistance in a safe zone the other side of the Gaza border with Egypt, in Egyptian Rafah, without Hamas diversion of aid, without Hamas firing missiles from humanitarian zones and therefore, putting Israel in that impossible situation. It's striking to me that that context is never addressed in the context of, the provision of humanitarian assistance for civilians in Gaza.
It is far from my position to suggest to the Egyptian government what they should or should not be doing in compliance with international humanitarian law. I will say that the geography of the conflict is unique in the sense that there have been very few cases, if any, in which the civilian population has not been allowed to evacuate from the entire area. And there are provisions in the Geneva Convention which allow for the application of demilitarized zones and for safe harbors. It just requires that both belligerent parties agree to not use those areas for combat functions. And the reason why the Muasi humanitarian zone is designated a humanitarian zone and a safer zone, not a safe zone or a DMZ, is because Hamas is not willing to do that declaration, which means they have the means to say, we are going to be carving out a part of the Gaza Strip, which is going to be civilian only,
Yeah.
and we're not going to be conducting anything from there. And they choose not to. Not only do they choose not to, but Mohammed Def was struck in the vicinity of the Mwasi safe zone. And that tells us that there is a deliberate abuse of the areas which Israel is designating as safer areas. Another thing that needs to be highlighted is even though this is the first instance of a heavily urban conflict in the area of the cell phone, excluding what's happening in Ukraine in certain specific areas, the IDF is going to unprecedented lengths to warn the population in the sense that we're not only giving out leaflets telling people where to evacuate with the specifics down to the block number, which has been assigned, but we're also highlighting the evacuation routes. And that gives the adversary an opportunity to either try to block the civilian movement from those areas or to misuse those same routes to smuggle fighters, weapons, or people through those routes. If you were to ask me if the IDF has any way to screen those people, the answer would be probably not. And that means that it is a non-zero chance that some of the hostages that were held in Gaza City were moved from Gaza southbound through the humanitarian corridors that we ourselves declared, further proving that Hamas is willing to use the cover of its civilian population as a tactic of warfare. And we know that there have been instances where civilian population, which are not affiliated to Hamas, have assisted Palestinian military organizations in keeping hostages. We have testimony from hostages that were released that were kept in overground apartments, and some of them were forcefully released by the IDF. We recently just had the Operation Arnon coverage for that. Those people were held in the house of civilians.
Oh.
So it is an incredibly challenging environment to operate in. And that's the third audience that we have to convince, the people that don't understand the challenges. Most people think of Hamas in the context of criminals. They think of Hamas in the context of gangs. And no, you do not get to arrest a gang member just because somebody who is affiliated to them happened to be in the vicinity of a crime area. They're thinking of them in the sense of criminal law, in the sense of human rights law. Under humanitarian rights law, if you can make a convincing case that a person is a member of an organized armed group, they become a military target by sheer affiliation, which is a concept which is entirely foreign to people that have not had to deal with this field of law. And it is a counterintuitive assumption that you need to make because you're not used to thinking in those terms. Even lawyers don't make that claim.
Jonathan, we've been drowning in questions, and I've been desperately trying to sort of group them together to give you the best flavor. We are really at the end, and there's a great deal more to address, but I know that the report covers a lot of it in detail. I think it's just important to highlight and, of course, explain that Operation Arnon was the rescue of the Israeli hostages, including Noah Agramani. For those of the audience that might not be familiar, it was named after the commander who lost his life in that successful extraction of hostages. It seemed to me, in condensing a lot of this quite dense data, and a number of the questioners have referenced the fact that there needs to be a kind of ease of communicating some of these points. I think it is important to highlight, as the report does, to the extent that Israel is providing these warnings, to the extent that Israel is depriving itself of the military advantage by putting precaution and the protection of civilians at such a high priority by calling off strikes, as the report references, to the extent that there are too many civilians at risk of being killed. That is a very clear indication of the intention by which the IDF is operating, which couldn't be further from what some of these allegations suggest. But also, when one looks at the statistics, and the report mentions that in the first 6 months of the war, Israel used 26,000 bombs. At the time, the Hamas casualty figures, as I recall them, were in the region of 20,000. So when one considers that that is less than one casualty to one bomb, these allegations of indiscriminate bombing, these allegations that Israel is doing anything other than very precisely targeting terror infrastructure and minimizing civilian casualties, just start to fall apart, I think, with key examples of facts of that nature. But it's critical that the report highlights, and in fact, I think concludes at least the executive summary with a warning which is far wider reaching than just this conflict. And it references future crises, including those where deliberate and systematic efforts are made to annihilate a national group. So, under the proper definition of genocide, with intention to do so, that for those future possibilities, those scenarios, the trivialization of these allegations of genocide and of war crimes may very well serve as an excuse for the actual commission of atrocities in the future. And therefore, it is paramount that international lawyers, humanitarian organizations who seek to protect vulnerable populations take this report and its contents very seriously and do their utmost to ensure that it is disseminated to decision makers, policy makers, the media, to all of the audiences that you've referenced. And I thank you very much indeed for all of what was, I'm sure, looking at the result of it, painstaking work in bringing this important information together. And you mentioned to me before that this report was written on the basis of consensus between all of the authors. So anything that wasn't entirely agreed was simply left out. So in that sense, I'm sure it only touches the surface of the magnitude of the information that is available. Lots of people have asked whether Israel is going to, in the hope that we're seeing now, a peaceful resolution. We'll have to wait and see whether this deal is in fact successful. But in the event that we are seeing the return of the hostages, the defeat of Hamas, and the end to this conflict, whether that false narrative can now be corrected is a very big question. I think your report will serve a very important part of the process to seek to achieve that. So thank you very much for joining us,
Thank you
and
for having
hopefully we'll come back to discuss future developments and the important impact that your work has been able to have on them.
Thank you for having me. And if there's only one takeaway that I can give to the audience here, is there's a Hebrew saying that a stone that's been thrown into a well by a fool takes a thousand clever men to take out. This webinar had the attendance of less than 1,000, but not by much. So let's pool our efforts, and together we can help hoist the load.
I'll say amen to that. Thank you.
Thank you.